This is going to be an interesting video. If you've watched this channel for a while now, you'll come to know that this channel is a lot about how much I love this camera, and this camera being the camera I'm filming with, which is the Panasonic S1H. Now, I've had this camera for a while now. I've had it for about 7 months, 8 months roughly. And so I've really gotten to test out a lot of its features. And like I mentioned, I really love this camera. But I'm all about being honest and unbiased and not having too much brand loyalty. I will use any camera that is required to get the job done, no matter what brand it is. So if you're thinking of buying an S1H, this will be a good video for you to watch and get to know more info on some of the things that may sway you to consider other options. But again, this camera is an absolute beast of a camera, and overall my experience has been very positive. So let's get started. My name is Dustin, your video tour guide, and please keep your arms and legs inside your chairs at all times. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The first thing I don't like about the camera is a big thing that I don't like, and it's the continuous autofocus for video. Guys, it's not very good. There is a huge debate about this, and I'm telling you to trust me when I say the autofocus is not good. Let me tell you guys a little bit of my experience using cameras. A lot of my background is actually in broadcasting and live events. I was the guy down on the football field operating those massive broadcast cameras, or at basketball games under the hoop, or at the top of the stadium, or the guy in the back of the room at a live event operating a camera. Now, I think a lot of people don't realize that good, reliable autofocus on a camera is very new technology, and most cameras out there do not have good autofocus. All of those broadcast cameras I used, I operated manually. When I was doing freelance work, I was also operating Sony EX1s or EX3s and got some experience operating the Red Dragon on some shoots as well. My first camera I owned was a Canon T3i, and eventually I moved up to the Sony A7S in 2015. My point is, I have quite an extensive background using cameras where the only option was to use manual focus because autofocus could not come close to tracking a moving subject or even a talking head for that matter. The first camera that I ran into that had autofocus where you barely even had to try was the A7R III, which was released in October of 2017. Then I bought the A7 III in 2018 and got very used to using very good autofocus, but because of my background, I'm still quite comfortable using manual focus when needed. And I realized that there probably was some other cameras like the Canon 1DX Mark II and stuff like that that had good autofocus as well, but I'm just using that as an example in my experience. And my point I'm trying to make is if you are used to using a camera that has good autofocus like the Sony A7 III or the Canon 1DX series, and then purchase this camera, you will be very disappointed in its autofocus ability. It does do a decent job with talking heads. Like for example, I do use autofocus when I'm filming these YouTube videos at an aperture of 1.4, and it does a decent job. But as soon as you start trying to track a subject and move around on a gimbal, you're going to get a lot of blurry shots. On the flip side though, if you have a background like me from before I bought an A7 III, if you purchase this camera, you may be very happy with the autofocus because it is definitely better than what those cameras were capable of because they weren't really capable of autofocus anyways. If you don't believe me, I made a video testing this where I not only used a Panasonic lens, but also used an L-mount Sigma lens side by side. Another thing, I don't really know how good the autofocus is for the photo side of the camera. I've used it in photo mode and plan on doing a video in the future testing this out, but from what I heard, the technology it uses for autofocus is a different story for photo and should be quite reliable, but don't quote me on it. I want to clear something up as well. A lot of people think this is something Panasonic can fix in the future with a firmware update, but I'm fairly confident that it's not true. I believe it is a hardware limitation of the camera. Yes, I know it hurts a bit. If you are wanting a camera with good autofocus and you love the features of this camera, be prepared though to be using manual 90% of the time. I am what you call a run and gun videographer, and trust me that you can get good at manual, and sometimes it actually helps you be more creative when it comes to your video because of what you have to do to get certain shots using manual that normally would be a breeze with autofocus. All right, now that that is out of the way, let's move on to the second thing. This one isn't as big of a deal, but man, it will drive you nuts. At least it drives me nuts. So when you go into manual focus, you'll notice this little tick box on the screen. When you flip it into autofocus, it disappears. What this box is for is when you want to check focus via magnification, this is telling you where it's going to zoom in on your image. But for the life of me, I have searched everywhere on how to make this disappear and just reappear when I need to magnify, but I don't think there is a way to disable it. So when you're in manual focus, you will always have to live with this tick box on the screen. It's super annoying and not as big of a deal breaker as the autofocus, but man, it's annoying. If you ever find a way to disable it, let me know, please, I'm dying. All right, let's move on to number 3. This one is kind of another ergonomics feature, which I actually covered in a previous video, and that's the location of the lens lock button. These 2 buttons above it are custom buttons you can set to be whatever you like. All the buttons have a different feel to them, which you would think would be helpful with not pressing this button, but I somehow still managed to accidentally click it instead of disabling what I have mapped to the other custom buttons. You could avoid this by just not using the custom buttons on the front, but I like to use this to enable and disable my focus peaking. The next one is another one I talked about in my other video, and that is the shutter wheel. I love the design of this, but this scroll wheel is way too easy to spin. It hasn't happened to me very often, but there's been several times that I've looked down and my shutter is not what I want it to be. Of course, there are some ways around this, like turning on synchro scan, which basically gives you the ability to select the exact shutter speed down to the decibel, or you can switch this to your aperture instead of shutter, so if you accidentally bump it, it's much better than bumping your shutter and not noticing. Or another thing you can do is set up your lock lever to lock the shutter. The only problem with this is it locks other functions as well, so you have to unlock it every time you want to change certain settings. Not a deal breaker, but kind of makes things inconvenient if you like your shutter being in that position. The 5th thing has to do with SD cards. You want to be very careful when you use certain SD card brands with this camera. There was a super big problem when it was first released with files getting corrupted on your SD card. From what I've heard, it didn't have anything to do with the camera, but more with the brand of SD cards. Panasonic recommends that you use V90 SD cards, and when I first bought the camera, I had one SD card that was a V90 speed. The brand 2 was called ProMaster. Probably never heard of them, but they are SD cards that are sold in my local camera shop. I decided I needed to buy a few more V90 cards and went with the Sony Tough V90 SD cards. Now this doesn't seem to be as big of a problem anymore, but it used to be a huge problem. I am lucky and only had one file get corrupted when I was shooting one of these YouTube videos, but it was enough for me to return those cards and buy 2 more of the ProMasters since I had done 2 shoots with my first one without any problems. The other 2 brands of SD cards I recommend are ProGrade or Panasonic. But keep in mind the Panasonic cards are pretty pricey, at least last time I checked. And if you want to go with the brand that I use, I found them on Amazon and there's a link to them in the description. And of course it's an affiliate link, so if you want to support the channel, it's an easy way to do that. I've shot for months without any problems using the ProMasters, but this is something you should be aware of before looking into this camera, and I would definitely want to know about this. Oh, and one other thing, make sure that you have the latest firmware because there were some problems with Vlog as well, but that seems to be fixed now, so just be aware. Make sure your firmware is always up to date on all of your cameras. And like I said again, it seems to be not as big of a problem anymore, so don't worry too much about your files getting corrupted as long as you follow those guidelines. The 6th thing is the lens selection. Now I actually had a good idea of what lenses were available before I purchased this camera, but if you're looking into this camera, I'd want to know that there aren't a ton of lenses currently to choose from for this camera, especially if you're wanting to get Panasonic lenses. I decided to buy the camera anyways because I knew I was going to go with the Sigma lenses, and there are enough lenses to get by, but it's something you should definitely look into before you buy the camera. One advantage though to this camera is you can buy a wide variety of adapters and can adapt a ton of different lenses to it. So just consider what kind of lenses you are wanting to get for the camera and what kind of adapters that you'll need, if any. The 7th thing is when you switch to slow motion in 4K, it's not going to be in 422 chroma subsampling. It's going to be in 420. Keep in mind it is still in 10-bit, and honestly, I haven't had any problems in post when I grade the 420 footage. But again, this is something I wish I knew, especially when the main selling point of this camera is that it does 4K 10-bit 422 internally, but it doesn't do it in slow motion, so just remember that. The 8th thing is the slow motion, particularly when you are recording at higher than 60 FPS. I've used the super slow-mo a few times, and when there is a ton of light, of course, there's not a ton of noise, but if it starts to get somewhat dark, the slow-mo is pretty noisy. This camera does super well in low light scenarios, but you definitely need to be aware you're going to need a lot of light if you want to avoid that noise. It does have dual ISO, but from my experience, it's still pretty noisy at those higher frame rates. The 9th thing is the histogram. The histogram is probably the tool I use the most when I'm running and gunning and trying to nail my exposure. Typically, I'll glance at it once I know what my shot is and just expose as bright as I can before my highlights clip. The reason I do this is I shoot in vlog a lot, and if you are wanting to get the cleanest image possible, it's wise to shoot brighter than you'd expect, especially when recording in log. The way the histogram is though on the S1H, it's super hard to tell, in my opinion, what my image is doing. So I have to rely more on what my exposure meter is telling me, which is fine, but there have been times when my highlights have been hotter than I wanted. I realize too, this isn't the best way to get exposure, but you can only do so much when you're running and gunning by yourself like me. You could set up your zebras as well to give you a better idea of where your highlights are at, or neutral gray, but personally, because I use manual focus most of the time, I'll have my peaking on, and having zebras on top of that is just too much for me to look at, and it makes it hard for me to pull focus accurately. You may be different than me, but just be aware if you're using the histogram, you may find it to be a bit difficult to read on the run. The final thing was actually brought to my attention by one of you guys. This isn't a big deal for me because I don't use it, but if you do, this could be a real annoyance to you, and that is the custom white balance feature. To set custom white balance, you want to take a picture of a gray card in your scene, then select that image of that gray card, and it should set your white balance correctly. When you use this feature though and set your custom white balance, it doesn't tell you what it sets your white balance to. You can modify the color, but wouldn't I want to know where my white balance was set to, even if I used the custom white balance feature? I think so, because although computers are really good at doing what they do, they're also not. So keep this in mind if you like to use custom white balance. And there you have it. 10 things I wish I knew before I bought the S1H. I will say again, if this is your first time coming across my channel, this is an incredible camera, especially if you like the features that come in a more cinema-like camera, just in a mirrorless body. Just watch basically any other video on my channel and you'll see. But it's not perfect, and it has its annoyances and features that I wish will be considered to be changed in future models or firmware updates if possible. Let me know down in the comments if any of these things swayed you one way or another, or even if you have the same frustrations with the S1H, because I'm curious if I'm not the only one. And if there are any other frustrations, also post those down below because I'm curious what they are. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a double thumbs up. And if you want to support the channel, consider checking out some of the affiliate links in the description to any gear or assets you're thinking of purchasing. I've also got more videos in the works as well, so be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell button if you want to be notified when I upload those videos. But in the meantime, happy filming.